Et salut tout le monde, aujourd'hui je reçois Smokey de Berachain pour parler un peu de son développement, comment c'est arrivé là et quels sont les plans futurs pour la blockchain. Hi Smokey, how are you?
Ah, bonjour tout le monde. J'ai parlé un peu de français, mais pas beaucoup. Mais je pense que je peux parler un peu, mais pas bien.
I didn't
um,
expect this.
yeah, no,
Okay.
I'm Canadian, so I at least
Oh,
had to spend enough time learning and and speaking French in my earlier years. I'm pretty bad nowadays, and I think that my
hmm.
French is best when I'm like drunk now, which is perhaps half confidence and then half old memories coming back. but
Yeah.
I'm largely retired. But yeah, man, I'm good. How about yourself?
Yeah, very good. Actually, I'm very happy to have you here. We got a lot of questions about Berachain these days, so that's perfect. We got POL live yesterday, so that's perfect timing. I think maybe not everyone know you. Can you a bit introduce yourself, what you've done in the past, and what's bring you to build Berachain?
Yeah, for sure, man. A little bit of context. I guess I've always been sort of a builder or a capital allocator for the better part of my career. I started sort of in a very different world, primarily in biotech and drug discovery slash pharmaceuticals, and sort of built my
Okay.
first company in that space. Then worked in venture capital for some time. Was
Mhm.
working on everything from sort of early stage hard tech, sort of biotech type deals to pre-IPO deals and SPACs and stuff, and like that sort of 2020, 2021 timeframe. And have been in and out of crypto since 2015, 16, when I was, first just messing around with ETH and Bitcoin and having fun along the way. So, in short, I guess I could say that my background has always been in building shit or helping other people build shit. And crypto felt like a pretty exciting space to be able to do so. In those same bounds.
Okay. I think the origin of Berachain is like the NFT collection. I
Yep.
was not there at this moment. I didn't know, what happened. How did you build a community first? Because I think you were one of the first that launched Nail One and had a community before that.
Yeah.
So what happened?
Yeah. Yep. Look, I think that the way that we see it is that it started very much as a happy accident.
Hmm.
In that Berachain very much started as something that was just entirely for fun. We had been spending a whole bunch of time in these different Discord servers, and basically like spending a whole bunch of time like these DeFi 2.0 worlds, if you will,
Hmm.
and less NFT oriented, if you will. But at the same time, had been seeing a whole bunch of interesting, cool stuff happening on the NFT side. This was like summer 2021. So you were getting different companies like Parallel
Hmm.
and others that were starting to take NFTs from just 10,000 pictures of monkeys to actually things with utility and more value, if you will. We thought that
Hmm.
was funky. Um, so just decided to honestly mess around and make an NFT project primarily catered towards a bunch of these like DeFi communities that we've been hanging out with for shits and giggles more than anything else. There wasn't a major grand vision at the time. It was just like, hey, we'll have
Hmm.
fun and we'll make an NFT and we'll see where it takes us. So we had 100 NFTs of bears smoking weed that were called the Bong Bears. Over
Hmm.
time, we've leaned away from the smoking weed part because it's not the best from an adoption point of view, but it's also just kind of funny. And
Hmm.
we basically at some point decided after enough feedback from the initial community to see what it could look like to actually have those groups, have more mechanisms to them, right? So we're like, okay, we could just end up releasing more NFTs, or we could find a way to effectively have them multiply over time. And we could say, okay, cool. You had one bear from this collection. Now, for free, you'll get a second bear from the next collection. And if you have those two, then you'll get two more. If you have those four, you'll get four more, et cetera, et cetera. On
Hmm.
one hand, driving value to those oldest holders, increasing the supply, making it less scarce, and allowing new people to sort of enter over time. And by doing so, we effectively, accidentally built a community of a couple thousand people who were both very risk on and like, down to mess around with funny multiplying and bear NFTs. But
Hmm.
we're also, fairly sophisticated, especially compared to your normal crowd within crypto, that they were, from these cutting edge DeFi protocols largely. And I'd say there's probably like an 80-20 split of people who were there for the NFTs and people who were there for like there for like the liquidity mechanics and there purely for the art, right? And I think
Hmm.
that's sort of what allowed this initial kernel of Berachain to form as we started talking to these people and saying, hey, what are things that you wish existed on chain? What are things that you think could be done better? And a lot of folks are thinking, hey, like, do I end up like staking with Lido, or do I end up, putting my capital in like a lending loop or in a borrow, a money market or something, right? Or
Mhm.
people were looking at building apps and they're saying, which chain do I build on? None of these are really helping me except for maybe throwing some grants at me. So I think that sort of helped give us the grounds for proof of liquidity.
Okay. Okay, I understand. And yeah, to make it simple, what will be the North Star here? It's like having the biggest L1 EVM focus on DeFi, something like this?
Uh, I wouldn't actually say it's all about being focused on DeFi. It's being the chain which is best suited for people who are looking to build something new and interesting. There's
Mhm.
of course like a very non-trivial initial focus or initial like bit of PMF in DeFi where there's very straightforward yields and things that are easy to understand. Or you can say, okay, cool, like my pool is earning X, now my pool is earning 1.1x or 1.2x or whatever it might be, with the help of proof of liquidity.
Mhm.
But I think that the bigger thing is actually the simple fact that the chain is built from the ground up to incentivize and to drive value to the application layer, right? Which is really the difference between all these other ecosystems. Because I think there's different misunderstandings around proof of liquidity, and we can do a better job of education here. But some people think it's like
Mhm.
external rewards being printed, or just like more, some people basically think it's like unsustainable beyond the scope of a normal L1. And the
Mhm.
difference is in most L1s, your block rewards, your inflation are going towards paying your validators and their stakers. In Berachain, while there is still a small amount that goes towards that, it's like 1-2%. The vast majority of emissions are actually going towards the ecosystem itself in terms of those dApps
Mhm.
and their users. So what Berachain is doing is it's directing that inflation into the ecosystem, and then it's also allowing applications to take advantage of that to bootstrap their own liquidity and their own use cases. So, we think that that's a pretty meaningful thing because it very much means that, the applications living on the chain have a better chance of succeeding and crossing that 0 to 1 gap than most other cases. So, being the place of where the best DeFi lives is of course important, but also being the best place where the best RWAs or consumer applications or DPINs or whatever it might be also, exist is similarly important.
Yeah, I like to say it's like you put the app layer in the middle of the consensus layer. But I think a lot of people know that POL is like the big things in Berachain. Maybe they
Yep.
don't get why is it important? Why is it an innovation? Could you, explain a bit why it's exciting for you and what could we see in the future, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, like a couple different things, right?
Mhm.
On one hand, like the reason why it's exciting for me is that I think that the problem that most applications end up facing at some point in their lifestyle or in their lifetime is sort of one of two things. One is like, how do we actually end up having liquidity such that, people can trade in and out of our token, right?
Mhm.
On one hand, there's a way to do that via like centralized exchanges, which are inherently a little bit more problematic slash only accessible to a subset of people, but also come with their own listing fees or perhaps deeper requirements, et cetera, that may not be there for every single different project. Um, Two is just broadly people need to figure out how to bootstrap users and how to actually make people use their product. And in many cases, that's almost a matter of activation energy, right? It's like what
Mhm.
is the critical mass of people that needs to be coming into here, or what's the critical mass of capital that needs to be flowing into this to make this trade efficient, or to make this protocol actually like break out a little bit. And I think that Berachain very much helps to solve that cold start problem for different applications, because one can incentivize just about any action that results in a stakeable token, right? And that's where it gets interesting because I think most people think, okay, proof of liquidity, DeFi, right?
Mhm.
And there's many different types of use cases within DeFi. However, it's also proof of liquidity, really any logic gated action, right? So you
Mhm.
could basically set up a system where someone, plays a game for X hours and then earns a token. And then that's actually something that's being incentivized via proof of liquidity, right? You could set up something where someone interacts with a DePIN device X amount of times, right? You could do
Mm.
something where, in the more trading sense, it's not just, okay, I'm providing liquidity to this pool.
Mm.
It could also be I'm trading perps and I've generated X amount of volume that's in turn generated Y amount of fees for the protocol. Therefore, I get this token, and that token has emissions being driven towards it, right? So there's lots of different ways to apply proof of liquidity, as a growth vector for different things within the ecosystem. And we think that that can be quite important, especially when it's used to jumpstart processes that can find their own point of cash flow positiveness or their own point of sustainability via the fees generated from their use.
All right. Personally, I love it, but I've seen some, just to play the devil advocate,
Of
sorry.
course.
I've seen some takes, mostly on X, of course, that say that maybe consensus doesn't have to be complex. They have to be very simple. Maybe, their take is that it just worse. The more you had, worse it get. What would be your vision on that?
Just in terms of like sort of the complexity or lack thereof.
Yeah, because all the validator have to, to choose the
Oh
apps,
yeah,
how much
yeah,
they
yeah,
give.
yeah, of course.
It's really an active
Yeah, there's
participation.
of course, and like I think it has to go both ways, to be honest, man. Because I think what most ecosystems suffer from in an extractive
Mhm.
sense is they get these validators or DApps or whatever it is that sort of check out, right? And
Mm.
then they just sort of end up setting and forgetting, extracting, dumping, rinse and repeat. And that's
Mm.
not a blanket statement. There are some validators or there's some people that are very net positive for an ecosystem and build lots of tooling and software and overall do a lot to make that ecosystem better. However, there's
Mm.
also a pretty meaningful group that like just kind of have a brand name, for example, use that to get a big delegation or a big stake from the foundation, and then dump on people, right? Um,
Yeah.
I think that actions or I think mechanisms that sort of bind the fate of the ecosystem and its growth to the fate of the people securing the chain can be helpful to some extent, because I think that like active participation is one of the things that is least effectively incentivized in crypto. Like, yes, you can do things where it's like, hey, I log on every day and I claim my rewards for this or that, but those often end up being pretty trivial things, right?
Mm.
That being said, I believe that the real answer is finding ways to allow interested users or interested, parties within this equation um, to get the best of both worlds in terms of simple like one-click type solutions or optimizers that might, a validator might be able to run that says, hey man, like, this will automatically allocate to the most profitable cutting boards, or this will automatically allocate
Mm.
to the most low risk vault strategies or stuff like that. And that's
Mhm.
some of the stuff that we know both teams in the ecosystem and our team have worked on at different points.
Mhm.
Such that, yeah, let's say someone isn't like super DeFi savvy or super like, mechanism savvy, they can have an easy option. That still doesn't mean, hey, you set and forget, but it still means that their incentives are broadly aligned with the ecosystem. It just perhaps requires a little bit less like effort to get off the ground. And I think that that's healthy, where it's like, hey, like, we're doing our best here, but this is also a complex system. Cool. Let's build,
Mm.
simpler solutions that accomplish that same intention with less steps required on the part of the initial user.
Mm. I see. And you talk about validator getting everything. I wonder what's your view on MEV? Are you more Ethereum side application should get it, or more Solana side?
Oh, I think it should totally go to applications. I don't think that. Yeah, I don't think that that's the case.
I agree. I agree. And what's interesting with Berachain is EVM identical. I didn't see another one like this, another blockchain like this. Why is it important?
Yep. Few reasons. Um, well, one is basically that like we've seen a lot of chains that claim to be EVM compatible, right? And
Mhm.
EVM compatible is a great initial baseline. You can use Solidity, and maybe you can deploy a lot of the same stuff as you can on a typical like ETH mainnet or even certain L2s, etc. The problem is like the nuance, right? And that in many cases there'll be differences in various EIPs and different opcodes in sort of more granular implementations of the EVM that can be quite difficult and quite different for app builders to work with. A lot of this also comes in from the peace of mind of like dev tooling and automation and all the stuff that reduces friction for someone looking to build. Um, and we at one point looked at maintaining our own fork of the EVM, and I'm sure, and I think it's highly likely that at some point in the future, as we make more proof of liquidity specific tooling, that we end up doing
Mhm.
so as well. But my take is that at the moment, really, our goal is to make it as easy as possible for a developer who's already familiar with the EVM as a whole to deploy something on Berachain. And the best way of doing that is actually to take advantage of the work that the ETH Foundation and other contributors to core ETH research are doing, in that it allows us to run unmodified Ethereum clients with Comet BFT for consensus under the hood. So we're really getting the best of both worlds. We're getting 6 times faster blocks, but we're still also getting the full compatibility with Ethereum and the full EVM. The other reason that this gets quite interesting is that it means that if people want to build scaling solutions to Berachain, L2s, Cub chains, whatever you want to call them, they can do so in the same way that they might on ETH mainnet, which is quite interesting from a vertical specific point of view as well, and even just like a cleanliness of execution layer, mempool, etc. perspective, as in you can very much have a setup where someone chooses to build a chain that's just for high performance trading, or just for consumer applications with tens of millions of users, or just for RWAs with tens of billions of dollars. That is inherently a little bit lower risk for some of those enterprises because they know they can roll back the chain, or they know they can handle millions of users without clogging up the L1, or they know that they can have super high performance there. And I think that having that potential is also great. I don't believe that L2s are necessarily always EV positive in the short run. I think that some of them very much can be, and I think that examples like Base have been very EV positive for Ethereum as a whole, for example. But I do think that in the grand scheme of things, and on the 5-10 year time horizon, there's a lot to be gained from that.
Okay, so you talked a bit about BeaconKit, which is the mix between Comet BFT and EVM-identical, I think. Do you have teams building on this? Do you have names right now, or is it adopted?
Well, I'd say that's at the early stages of adoption, and that there's 2 or 3 different groups that are looking at building around it. But I would be honest in saying that BeaconKit adoption has not been our primary point of interest, because at the end of the day, we have to think about running a business, right? Building open source software is great, and it can definitely open up new possibilities for people. But unless there's a clear path towards value accrual for the groups who actually built that and are utilizing it, it's not necessarily the best use of our time. That being said, there are a couple groups we work back and forth with, and groups who are looking at helping contribute more and more to BeaconKit that we are pretty excited about. But they're also in fairly early stages and/or stealth, have raised non-trivial venture capital dollars, etc., and are thinking about ways that they can help make that system better over time. But we sort of ended up, building it for our own needs, and I think it ends up, checking the right boxes for quite a few different groups.
Okay, I see. So we talked about POL getting live yesterday. So we might see some crazy incentive, I guess. Maybe a new DeFi summer, I guess. I hope. What are you expecting, you personally?
I mean, it's a good question, man. I think it's more just we're trying to see cool new stuff happening. I think that what this is really exciting for more than anything else is the ecosystem as a whole, and starting to see incentives flow to lots of new places. And I think that ideally those are places that drive value to Bera and Honey and/or strong alts within that ecosystem. I think in the past, we've seen people, even liken it to an avalanche rush kind of thing, which I think is not quite correct, because avalanche rush was sort of external, or not external, but sort of one-time incentives. Whereas POL is very much something that has on one hand, a degree of value accrual to BGT holders, and on the other hand is sort of it's a continual sustainable program that's powered by the chain itself and its emissions, not just us saying, okay, we're gonna ask the foundation to shell out X $million of incentives. So yeah, I mean, I think that it's exciting all around. I think that we're starting to see some folks really get cool adoption, and I think that we're seeing applications start to lean into it and post different incentives, and then play strategic games at the chain level. Which I just don't think has been done yet. And I think that it's going to be only more exciting for the weeks to come as more and more people get in there and the system gets more efficient.
All right. And what's the security around the POL? Because not every app get to be part of. So is it permissioned? Will it be forever? Is there KYC? Are you checking emission? Other question.
Yeah, couple different things. So when you talk, there's levels to it, right? And it's very much governance, mediated, in that every different team that has received effectively. Let me start from the top. When Berachain started, or when the chain went live, proof of liquidity emissions only went to one destination or one application on the chain, which is the DEX that's sort of built into the chain. And that's intended, right? It was very much meant to be, okay, we want to make sure that the supply is effectively decentralized. We want to make sure that there's a safe venue where people can deposit their capital and earn emissions slash BGT. And we want to make sure that there's effectively a good capital base being built on the chain as well. But of course, we don't want it to just turn into osmosis, right? I think the bigger thing was, okay, like after some period at which the ecosystem is stabilized, the chain is in a good state, etc., we can start gradually removing those rate limiters. So there's a couple parts of this process. One is sort of like the phase that we're in right now of governance, sort of governance phase one, in which there's a guardian council that is effectively appointed by the BGT Foundation, primarily made up of folks who are outside of Berachain, as in, so like not team members from labs, foundation, etc., but rather technical auditors, economic auditors, community members, folks who have effectively been part of the development of Berachain over the last couple of years. So on one hand, they're informed enough about what is net positive, what is net negative for the chain as a whole, and on the other hand, they don't have an internal bias per se. Of saying, oh yes, like we like this app, therefore they need to get a reward vault. And then so those groups effectively help to ratify or deny different proposals to start. And in order for a team to submit a proposal, there's a pretty extensive process. On one hand, there's sort of like a basic form that's filled out and sent to these members of the council, and to our internal quantitative / risk team that helps to comment on that as well. And it's basically looking at, okay, what's the pool or what's the vault that you want to incentivize, or you want to have emissions directed towards. Cool. What are the tokens that make it up? What are the audits on the platform where this liquidity is hosted? What are the audits on anything that you guys have put out as well? How does this contribute towards the ecosystem? Basically just a holistic assessment at the social layer, technical layer, and economic layer, to see if there's a way that this could be, hostile or value extractive, and is there a way that this actually helps Berachain itself? These forums or these forums / these proposals are also all posted on the Berachain governance forums, so people can comment on them, they can engage with them, they can do whatever they want there. They can say, hey, this seems wrong to me, and they're very much meant to be max transparency. And then within the next couple of months, this will transition into a fully on-chain governance system. So it won't be, a multi-sig executing and adding new reward vaults. It'll be the BGT holders as a whole getting to control entirely, like, hey, this is good, this is bad. That governance council, or those guardians, if you will still exist to veto, highly malicious protocols. Let's say someone goes in there and tries to do a curve style attack, or a Batman pool where it's one meme coin versus another meme coin, just use that to farm the chain. They will exist to help prevent those sorts of things. But in the interim, it'll be very much a matter of just let the chain govern, and let the people who have done the most work for the ecosystem and put the most skin in the game in terms of having BGT, do the work.
Okay, so do you think the DAO are ready, to have this responsibility right now? Are you not scared about centralization, something like this?
In what sense? As in, am I worried about whether the ecosystem / I guess which party are you worried about, or should I be worried about being ready?
Because if you put the everything on governance, you might see some centralization on the BGT.
Yeah, to some extent, as in but I think that's going to emerge to some point either way. And there's already groups who are trying to build LSTs around BGT, etc. It's more that there's almost an inevitable choice. It's either we always have the system have some element of centralization in terms of these guardians, having a role in that process, or we have a system that is truly decentralized, and gives the most power to the people who have contributed the most value to the ecosystem, but still has that emergency brake / that veto process in cases of emergency. So I think the true answer is there isn't a perfect solution, but moving towards on-chain governance over time feels like the closest thing that is both in lines with the ethos of decentralization, is legally sound, and is something that allows the chain to proceed in a manner that's very sustainable, right? Of course, it'll just be a matter of making sure that there's also the right type of social consensus, and there's the right type of security measures in place, such that if anything was to go wrong, there's a way to fix it, right? But you also can't have like a blast like situation where someone just goes and like says, "Okay, we're gonna undo that. We're gonna roll back the chain."
Yeah. And I've seen a lot of takes also on validator centralization. Maybe you already respond with the social consensus, but did you thought about this? If a validator get all the incentive and monopolize all the game on all the POL?
I mean, like, I think that the only way that that can happen is if one validator group gets so much BGT that they can fill every incentive. But if that's the case, like, good job. I mean, I don't mean that in that like the chain security either way is going to be spread out across a whole number of people and and that group of 69 right now and will be 100 plus in the future validators are still going to be responsible for securing the network in either way. But in the same way that Lido, controls what 30+% of Ethereum stake or something like that, and
Yeah.
Coinbase ETH is in a similar position. I forget exactly what it was, like 10, 20 plus. Like, I mean, if you build a system that people want to use, then I think the economics can respect that as well, right? I think that, however, there's already more systems in place on Berachain than almost anywhere else to this point that allow new validators or allow validators to have competitive edges over each other. In that, validators on Berachain can choose to point their emissions towards different protocols, right? So with that, you're inherently incentivizing people to have different levels of you're effectively inherently allowing people to pick their risk preference when they delegate to you, right? So most validators cannot necessarily have that degree of opinionation within a standard proof of stake chain, but in this case there's actually meaningful ways in which a validator can stand out from the group, right? Now look, there's lots of nuance there, and someone could say, oh, but like this validator is way bigger than that one, therefore I want to delegate to it, right? But for those who actually choose to go in the weeds and understand the technicalities as much as possible, I believe that it actually inherently incentivizes more stake decentralization than most other systems.
All right. And you talk a bit about validator sets. So you said 69, something like this. Are you going to expand this? What's the goal? The end goal. How much validator you want?
Of course. Look, I think the answer is, of course, as much as possible, but there's very much a performance trade-off, right? Berachain still uses Comet BFT under the hood for consensus, and there's that requires a lot of peer-to-peer connections / interactions. And if that set gets too large, then you just get sort of too much gossip, and you end up in a position where your block times are slow. And right now, Berachain's sitting around 2-second block times. I'd love to find a way to bring that even lower over time, to like the 1 second or so range. And just I think have the best, most seamless user experience from that point of view. I also believe that without going on too much of a tangent, like there's a lot of work that can be done to improve UX on the front end side that doesn't even necessarily overlap with the chain's underlying block time or gas per second, etc. But the practical answer is I think that we'll have a validator set that's probably between 100 and 150. And we'll continue working with the core research team to find ways to drive that up over time while maintaining that sort of like 2 second and change block time. That way we just don't end up in a situation where it's like, oh no, like you feel like this is like clunky to use, but you also know that the ecosystem and the network is quite robust.
Yeah. I think Hyperliquid used Comet BFT before and use a variant of hot stuff later. Do you think that's an option for you or not at all?
You know what? Like it's something that I would say that we have tentatively discussed internally. I think a lot about what makes something truly battle tested, right? And I do think that there's very interesting stuff coming out with the hot stuff, the sort of like hot stuff development. It's not something that I am personally smart enough on as of yet to comment on in a knowledgeable manner. But what I can say is that from looking at the headlines and from what little pieces I do know, it's interesting. But of course, the devil is always in the details.
Yeah. All right. To be honest, I got a lot of friends that farm airdrops, and they like a lot Berachain. There is a vibe, but usually they say it lack killer apps. Do you think? Do you have a plan for this, or what's your view on this?
Yeah, I mean, like my take is that a lot of quote unquote killer apps, come about in certain market conditions. I think that right now, or maybe even like in the last month or so, trying to actually launch a quote unquote killer app could be an exercise in futility. Because in most cases, when markets are contracting and when situations are bearish, it takes oxygen away from the fire. So something that could easily turn into a growth flywheel when people are a little bit risk off, can have a much lower chance of contagion and growing. I think that we're much more likely to see those killer apps emerge within the next, sort of like 3 to 6 months, and likely even sooner. And I think there's still a number of different opportunities for what those could be. Um, but I think that like that explosion has to happen during a time in which the market is somewhat risk on. Because I think that to get the degree of scale that one can, classify as a killer app, um, you need for people to be willing to experiment. And I'd say over the last little while, until very recently, and even still, like right now, right, like people are pretty, they're still pretty hesitant to do much and do more than sit on their hands. I think we went from hyper risk
Yeah.
on, like meme
Mm.
coins only, to hyper risk off, and now we're sort of like normalizing and finding that happy medium. Um, so in short, I do believe that there's a few of these on the horizon. I wouldn't want to jinx it in terms of what they could be yet. But in my mind, there's probably
Yeah.
10 to 15 different groups on the horizon as things that very much can be like that big winner.
So if you say that mean killer apps could happen in 3-6 months, that mean you're also maybe bullish on this year, right?
I mean, I think I'm not smart enough to know whether to be bullish or bearish, but I think I
Yeah.
have to be a perma bull, because I'm running an altcoin and like running a company. Right. But I
Mm.
also I think that from time spent, with some of the smartest people I know,
Mhm.
I think that the simple answer is there's never been a wider gap between sentiment for crypto natives and people with
Mhm.
actual money. And that's that in itself is a kind of fucked sentence, but it's also true.
Mm.
People on the timeline are wringing their hands at times and being like, "Oh, it's going to zero. We're all over, et cetera, et cetera." Um, and then other people, who I'd say in most cases control or help deploy magnitudes more capital, are like,
Mhm.
actually, this is incredibly bullish. The market structure is well set up for from especially from a regulatory perspective.
Yeah.
I think it's more that the buck has shifted.
Mhm.
And in the past, there was a lot of like relentless optimism or belief that the institutions were coming to buy our bags that made people like, bullish. And now it's like,
Mhm.
okay, the institutions are like getting ready to figure out where to deploy capital. But they're also trying to do so in a manner that's a lot more institutional and fundamentally
Mhm.
driven, and a lot less like, oh, this is going to go up because they got a big community on Twitter, or a lot less that this is going to go up because the vibes
Yeah.
are good. And to be
Mm.
fair, that's part of it, right? But I think
Mhm.
that people are returning a little bit later, a little bit more to fundamentals, and things that can be understood within a traditional business model. Um,
Mhm.
and I think that in that context, things are quite bullish. In that when you look at where
Mhm.
we are now versus like 2, 3 years ago, right? Like
Yeah.
there are many fundamentally better options for earning yield. There are
Mhm.
many, fundamentally more, I'd say, sophisticated financial products to the tune of Athena, et cetera. There are groups that are, I'd say, commercializing large staking products in the form of EtherFi and making that accessible to consumers. There's
Mhm.
stuff that makes the space way more accessible in terms of your account abstraction, like your Biconomy, Fun XYZ type stuff. Like all these things make people's lives significantly easier and make it more feasible for institutional
Mhm.
or like less sophisticated initially capital to get a lot smarter. So that's just why I think that there's a pretty a pretty good setup for the next little while. I just don't know for sure in terms of like which way it goes.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Just to get back, on the subject, from your personal view, what is there an app you're excited about? An app you want to share, something you're looking at, maybe not live yet.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hesitant to say as much, just because there's A, you never know if something's gonna go live till it's live.
Yeah.
But B, I think that there's just like I think that a lot of the best apps almost come out when you have no no knowledge of them at times. Like as in, I think the two types of apps that tend to do really well within an ecosystem are ones where the core team has been quite heavily involved and knows all the intricacies. And there's
Yeah.
quite a few of those. And then there's some where it's like, where the fuck did this come from? But it just starts, getting a ton of traction, right? I think that one that a lot of people liked recently that is part of the Build a Bera program is called Stablehold, and we think it's like very funny because it's like the horse hedge fund. The joke like the joke and the actual product, which I think is like quite interesting here, is it's effectively fractionalized ownership of horse stables. And first people think about that in terms of like, oh, you can bet on horses and like see if they win races and stuff. And that's part of the equation, but I think that's the least exciting part. I think the much more exciting part of it is horse breeding, because so many of these syndicates, or so many horses are owned by these syndicates. And basically you can take a very prize-winning, well pedigreed horse, that might cost somewhere between 750, 1.5 million, something like that, and effectively crowdfund slash buy it. And then, if it's a retired champion, you can have that thing breeding nonstop, which is to say like 200 times a year for anywhere between, 5 and 25K a pop. And I'm using, I'm using numbers that I don't believe are deeply, deeply accurate, but are directionally correct. And with that, like, you can get 300% APY on horse breeding. I think that's fucking hilarious. And I think that's one of these things that like is, it's an interesting, scarce market. There's an interesting, pull from almost a psychological perspective, because I think a lot of like the nouveau riche want to find a way to engage in things that are like old money coded, like horse racing and horse betting, right? And it's also just like good money. So I think all these things are very like correct and Bera coded. And it's one that I've been excited about recently, just because I think it's so funny and like so culturally correct for Berachain.
Okay, that's very interesting. There was a lot of hype before the mainnet with Berachain for a whole year, maybe 2 years. We've seen some video on events that was crazy. How do you make sure that this hype stick?
I don't
after
think you do.
mainnet?
I don't think that you want the same degree of hype after mainnet, because pre-mainnet, expectations aren't priced in. Post mainnet, they are. You actually want to shake out all the people that were just sort of there to ride the hype. I think you want to build a very strong community around the people that remain and that are equally excited about the reality of the project as they were about its imagination. And then you want to rebuild, or I don't know about rebuild, but you want to build forward, right? I think Solana is a good example of this, in that, super hype at one point, sort of had a hero's journey up, got absolutely like, just slapped in the face for a little while by all the stuff with FTX and that whole ecosystem, and then came back much stronger, right? And I think they're sort of seeing that again with like the whatchamacallit, with the whole sorry, I'm just derping for a second, with the whole like meme coin cycle. Like there was a good degree of extraction, then they're coming back at full speed, right? I think that's sort of like that's sort of like the energy that we think is exciting and lasts.
I understand. There is another question I got a lot of times. Nowadays we see a lot of very fast L1, crazy fast, and you just come with 2-second block time, maybe something like 80 TPS. Firstly, are you going to improve that measure, and do you think that will be enough, to get the market share?
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't think that it's interesting, right? Because a lot of these fast block time chains started with the thesis of like, we're going to have the best DeFi ecosystem possible here. But even if you look at the chains that have fast block times at the moment, like, Say, for example, like that thesis hasn't really played out. And that's not meant to be like a dig at Say or anyone else for that matter. It's actually more just like, I don't think that the answer that people are looking for from an adoption point of view is higher block times. I think it's a good narrative. Faster block times. I think it's a good narrative, and I think that it can be a good indicator and a good tool to improve user experience. I think it also comes with its own massive host of problems in terms of website front ends, in terms of RPCs, in terms of wallet infrastructure, etc. So in some cases, you can end up creating more problems than you're solving. at least off the top. But I do think that we would like to continue bringing block time down, but to the point of like, I think there's a threshold, right? And there's probably like two different ways of looking at this. One is like you just want to be able to click the button, click confirm, and then the transaction confirms within like a second or something. I don't think that people lose their mind if they have to wait for a second or two. I think that when you get 3, 4, 5, you're like, oh fuck, is this happening? Yeah, that's when people trip out, right? And you have a change to user experience. Like I said before, I think this can also be very elegantly accomplished with certain dApp front ends. And I do think that like account abstraction solutions are also helpful in this sense. Yeah, so like, I and then I think the other extreme is like perhaps sort of where Mega ETH is trying to go, which is like, you press a button and the transaction is confirmed before had a second
Yeah,
process, right?
it's great.
And I think that like that's certainly something that will appeal to people as well, and I hope that does really well. I just don't think it's a be all and end all. I think it's a UX improvement. But I think like building a chain / an ecosystem is so multifactorial, sorry, that I think that it's like one of many boxes to check, but by no means like, the be all end all.
I see. And recently we have seen Paradigm coming with stateless validation. Could it be something that's make it faster? Are you
Potentially.
interesting? Yeah,
I mean,
because
it's
EVM,
not something
right?
that, yeah, 100%. It's not something that I've dug into a ton, but potentially.
Okay, that's very interesting. Just one last critiques, because you're a new chain, so you got a lot of critics. That's basic.
Of course.
Everyone say, why do we need a new L1, L1 EVM or not? Why do we need this? What's your vision?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it sort of goes a little bit towards what I mentioned in the past, in that there aren't any chains right now that are built in favor of applications. They're built in favor of infrastructure providers, in some cases stakers / delegators, but none of these chains put power in the hand of the apps, right? And the users, for that matter. And I think that my thesis, or I think the collective thesis here, is that if crypto is going to win or scale in the long term, it will be very much defined by applications, and applications that ideally accomplish things that cannot be easily done via traditional rails, and it'll allow those to scale to millions of people, right? So I mean, like my real take here is that Berachain is a chain that gives the best chance for applications to succeed, from a mechanism point of view, and drives the most value by far to the application layer. So that's sort of where my head goes on it, and I think that's why we need a new L1 that actually helps to build that at the base layer. And what's interesting is I think we've seen other chains start to adopt that, whether that is sort of like Initia's VIP program, or Corn's gauges, etc., or Mode implementing VE emissions, etc. Like all these things are sort of adjacent to proof of liquidity, and I think that that's just an increased realization by the market that the way for a chain to win is by favoring its applications.
Yeah, the risk is fragmentation. But do you think, because you're EVM identical, do you think you can be a bit composable with all the Ethereum and layer 2 ecosystem?
And like we have sort of every major bridge supporting on our side. There's been more inflows to Berachain than any other chain in the past week, month, day, etc. So I think that we're pretty accessible from that point of view, and I just hope it continues to scale well.
Is it possible you could be add to the work of across on Superchain or something like this, or is it not possible at all?
Well, I think like I can't say that I'm knowledgeable enough on the Superchain side, because my understanding was that you had to be built around OP stack, but I could be wrong there. I suspect that might be more difficult, but plugging into intent bridges like Cross, yeah, totally feasible.
Oh, okay, all right. So what's the next plan for we got POL yesterday? What's the next plan for Berachain this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's sort of proving out the PL works and is sustainable. It's a number of improvements on the product / UX side. It's probably making it easier to get into different reward vaults, making some of these processes around POL simpler from an application point of view. Helping to display as much information as possible about how these incentive marketplaces work. Basically, just doing as much as you can to make it easy for people to interact with the parts of Berachain that are beyond the norm slash like not super what's the right word not super average, if you will, right, and not super fine in proof of stake chains. So yeah, man, I think that's like sort of the next big thing that we'll be spending time on. I think that there's going to be a lot of work that people don't expect on the sort of like more traditional slash institutional side. Because the fact is a lot of us came from more traditional backgrounds and are not unfamiliar with or have no issues with building stuff in the space that appeals to suits. And I think that beyond that, there will also be some major upgrades from the VM side. In that, Berachain will also basically like follow along with Pectra slash Ethereum upgrades. We'll have withdrawals slash unstaking. So a lot of that will come out in Q2 as well. And then continuing to grow the team and hire strong people internationally.
Okay, very interesting. And from personal point, what excites you the most to work on Berachain? What make you wake up on the morning and continue to build?
Yeah, I mean, I think I enjoy I enjoy the fact that Berachain doesn't quite make sense. Not when I say that, I don't mean that from like a usability point of view. I don't like the fact that it doesn't always make sense from a usability point of view. But I do think that it's hilarious that a group of anonymous bears that started as an NFT project have very much like flipped the playbook on many different parts of the space and have ended up building something that's cool and feels culturally correct. In that I think that there is a lot of stupidity and retardation around Berachain, but there's also a lot of competence. And I believe that working at the intersection of those two things is the most exciting and most fun. And I think it's very like the most fulfilling thing to see is probably when people go out and take something that we've built and build interesting things around that, right? And use that as a building block slash a part of their whole business, their livelihood, whatever it might be. I think that's the stuff. And then, seeing how community members form around that, seeing how the social layer forms, I think that's all quite interesting.
All right, awesome. I just got 2 more questions. First, is there a subject I missed you want to talk about?
No, nothing really off the top, man.
All good. And second, usually I ask if you got an advice because you're in the space for some years now. Maybe you got a lot of experience. And what will be the advice to someone that want to be part of the adventure, learn about crypto or whatever, just something?
I mean, yeah. I mean, I think the best thing it depends on what angle you're approaching it from, right? I think the best thing is like if you're someone who just wants to learn about crypto, the best way of doing so is learning by doing, right? I think that one can watch videos or can read guides or whatever forever. But there's nothing that replicates the experience of putting your own capital on chain and saying, fuck it, I'm going to give this a go. I think for someone looking to build, I think that now more than any time is one where the space needs high quality human capital and talent that goes beyond the norm. And I think that perhaps even more importantly, the space needs people who are willing to put forward new ideas. I think we've the biggest thing that crypto lacks is also just interesting new ideas that should exist. So I think that that's one of those things where you want people who are audacious, you want people who have novelty of thought, and you want people who are willing to chew a lot of glass, as people have said before, to get a certain thing done, right? But I think that can also be very what's the right word? That can be very valuable to the right group.
Ok. Thanks a lot, Smokey. Si jamais vous avez des questions, n'hésitez pas à suivre du coup Smokey sur X et puis toute la team. N'hésitez pas à suivre le compte X de Berachain. Et puis sinon, vous allez sur notre Discord qui est gratuit et poser des questions. Nous, on maîtrise plutôt bien le sujet. Et voilà, merci d'avoir regardé. Thank you a lot, Smokey, for coming. Really, I appreciate. That was really interesting. And I hope the best for Berachain.
Okay, merci tout le monde.
See you, man.